The other day, we got a really good comment on a video that we put out, which was called, "Here's Why You Need to Spend on Existing Customers." And the purpose of this video was to explain that for a small portion of brands, it is actually incremental to be allocating a budget towards existing customers. And we've seen that across multiple accounts now. Now, the caveat that this then brings is that if you're using acquisition MER as a core metric for standardizing performance, which for clarity for those that aren't across acquisition MER, it's net new customer revenue divided by ad spend. And the purpose of using this metric is because the purpose of ad spend should be to drive new customer revenue. And so it is the best direct measure of ROI out of the paid media channels. However, if you're then going to go and allocate budget to existing customers, how do you then go and recalculate your acquisition MER? Because the reality is now that let's say 10% of this budget is not for new customer acquisition, we need to remove that because now we're just diluting the actual ROI by including existing customer revenue in here. And so how do you exclude the spend to existing customers in the calculation? Do you do it at all? Now, the brief answer that I gave here was that yes, you'd want to calculate without that existing customer revenue. And so you'd actually want to adjust your acquisition MER calculation to not be inclusive of your existing customer campaign budget allocation. And so if you're, for example, staying static at 10% allocation over time, this would actually be really easy to do in any reporting platform. You just add a 90% adjustment here. If it's going to be dynamic over time, you would just filter out a particular campaign from this automatic equation that you're calculating in any kind of analytics dashboard. But that raises another issue, which is that means that if you're doing P&L based profit contribution, you need to then go and allocate this spend somewhere. So the reality is that this spend doesn't just disappear. You are still spending 10% of your ad spend on existing customers. So where does it sit? Where does it get picked up in reporting? Does it get picked up in MER? Does it get picked up in the total profit contribution? Like, how are you allocating this? And then what Luke did was add something that I think is a even better point, which really confuses this and honestly is what striked this video up, which is, I wonder how this will affect the reliability of LTGP to CAC. Because generally, when you're looking at repeat purchases, you're not associating a marketing expense to a repeat purchase. In fact, that's one of the big value propositions about retention, about repeat purchasing, is that you pay for the customer acquisition cost once, and then you get all of these repeat buys where you no longer have to pay an acquisition cost because they simply come back and buy again. Or they come back and buy again to a very cheap channel like email or SMS. So what does that do? How do you approach this? How do you look at actually segmenting this out and reporting on it? And there's a lot of different approaches, and I'm actually not sure what the best approach is. I think it's really dependent on the founder or the marketing manager or even the CFO, how they actually want this represented. But there's really two core paths that you can go down. And once again, this is also going to depend on your ability to generate these kind of reports and speak in this kind of language as well. And so direction number one is that you're reporting across two separate metrics, which you should be doing. You're reporting across new customer profit contribution. And for context, this is contribution margin 3. And then you're also reporting on returning customer profit contribution. And so we have both of these getting calculated on a daily basis in our dashboards. Now, from here, for those that aren't familiar with this metric, how we're actually getting here is we're taking revenue, we're minusing off all associated cost of delivery expenses. So this isn't just inclusive of cost of goods, but includes shipping and fulfillment and transaction fees as well. And then we're also minusing off ad spend. Now, in this case, we're minusing ad spend. In this case, we're not. Over here, we're just doing rev minus cost of delivery. And so effectively, returning customer profit contribution is identical to returning customer gross margin because there's no ad spend allocation here. But this changes, obviously, if you are then going to actually have a percentage allocation or a dollar value allocation over to returning customer profit contribution. So let's say that theoretically, you want to allocate $10K a month to returning customers on MER. Well, now you would take this out of here. So let's take this out of this amount. and you would go and allocate it over here. And so you would be minusing 10K. And so then when you ultimately distill down to your total profit contribution, which is just this plus this equals total profit contribution, it is correctly reflective of the actual profit contribution within the business. But when we're looking at metrics one step up, we are now actually getting accurate profit contribution numbers across both of these metrics. And so we are able to identify and optimize across this. So for example, if returning customer profit contribution goes down, obviously we want to look at all the levers that exist to improve that. But we also have an additional lever, which is maybe we're overspending here. And so maybe we want to change this budget allocation. And vice versa over here, if we're underperforming, nothing really changes, except for the fact that we might want to make a tactical or an experimental change here and actually allocate more spend over to here and see what happens. And so that's something that you could run. It's very hard to run that in a quasi way where the data is going to be relatively not causal, but you can do it anyway. Now, in this case, this also allows you to then calculate a blended CAC here that is non-inclusive of returning customer revenue, and it allows you to calculate acquisition MER that also is non-inclusive of the returning customer ad spend allocation. Now, the issue that this ends up causing, which is incredibly valid, is that if you're optimizing across, let's say, a 30-day LTCM to CAC ratio, this CAC is now not reflective of the actual spend that's going to go into LTCM. And so you might be, for example, sitting on a $20 CAC now that we've adjusted out that ad spend, when in reality, if you calculated this normally, maybe let's say it's 25, you know that your 30-day LTGP, so effectively your first purchase gross profit, let's say is $40. So now this metric is a 2. The nice thing is, if you're looking at LTGP to CAC ratios over a 30 to 90-day time horizon, doesn't really mean anything. Because the reality is that no matter who you are, no matter what your brand is, ad spend, I can guarantee, pretty much is never incremental within the first 90 days of purchase. If it is, it's very, very minimal. Like, you should not be allocating a low budget to people that have just purchased. It's just not really going to drive much of an impact. Now, to be fair, that's all based on anecdotal evidence and personal experiences. So I could be wrong. There could be really good studies out there that prove otherwise that I just haven't seen. But from my current understanding, I don't think that's a good idea. And so what that ends up meaning is that your reliability of LTCM to CAC or LTGP to CAC ratios over a 30 to 90-day period still holds accuracy. Where you start to see decay in accuracy is as you expand the numerical value here. Sorry, the time value here. And so as this starts to expand to 90-day plus, then you start to have media spend allocation into the efficiency, which is going to erode it. And so what's the solution here, right? Because like once they hit 90 days, do we then go and like decay the profit contribution slightly so that the gross profit a bit to factor in the fact that we're allocating an extra $1 to $2 to reacquire these customers to get that lift? It's like, how do you actually run the math there? It's actually, well, my recommendation is pretty simple, which is that if you're indexing towards, for the sake of this, let's go 365-day LTGP to CAC. There's no point in doing like fancy math and trying to allocate spend at the 180, 365 day. The ultimate purpose of this metric, like what is the reason why you would ever calculate this and why you would ever monitor it? Now, monitoring an LTGP to CAC ratio on this type of time range is like, you can do it, we do it, but you can't really, like, this is such a lagging indicator that it's kind of not productive. It's productive for planning in terms of where can we take CAC But in terms of like a 365-day LTGP to CAC ratio eroding over time, like you won't know for 365 days until if today's cohort is going to be worse than last month's cohort, because it just takes so much time for the cohort to actually come back and purchase. And so in my opinion, it's not even really productive as a performance marketing team to be looking at this metric and trying to optimize towards it over time. Now, maybe as the founder, this is like a North Star metric that you want to improve. So the question is, why are we even looking at this? Right? Why is this metric even talked about? Why are we even looking at it? Well, the reason why you're looking at it is to assess the quality of the business. Because ultimately this becomes just a measure of your total capacity to generate both a contribution profit percentage, but then ultimately you can infer a net profit percentage as well if you have an understanding of your operating expenses. And so this number will tell you, well, can you operate at 40% now? Is that even viable? Or are you running a really thin operation to where like you're going to be 5-10% now? Like what is this looking like? And so for clarity, in case you don't know how to standardize this metric, less than a 1 on a 365-day period is terrible, because that means you still haven't made money after 365 days of acquisition. This isn't even a business. Like this isn't viable. You wouldn't even be able to still be liquid unless you have massive capital raises that are funding this. 1 to 2 is like, okay. You could further break this down into 1 to 1.5, which is very mediocre. 1.5 to 2 is okay. Then you get into kind of this 2 to 2.5 range, which is like good. You could operate quite a profitable business here. You have to run the math, particularly for your own business in terms of operating expenses, etc. But there's businesses in this range sitting on 20% EBITDA. And then where you start to get into a really nice position is when you're at a 2.5 to 3. This is generally great. This means you can run really profitable. And then 3+ generally just infers that you're probably not going hard enough. Like you could grow way faster if you just invested more heavily into paid media and it was incremental. And like that's a little caveat that's worth stating, which is if you're at a 3+, it doesn't mean go and take 500 grand and spend it on radio ads next month. Like, obviously that's not going to incrementally grow the business and the CAC is just going to blow out and there's just no point in even spending. But if you can spend in a place that's going to continue to deliver similar levels of CAC, then you are simply underspending. Like this is a golden goose that you should just be cranking up. And then the same thing applies to 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. And so when you're doing this measurement, ultimately what you're trying to find out whenever and because we run this in all of our audits to figure out where they're actually sitting, the question I want the answer to is, are they underspending right now? Are they overspending? Or is their acquisition in a bad, terrible, okay position? Because like for full transparency, when I audit brands and they're in a 1 to 2 range, we have a very stringent internal discussion about whether we actually want to work with this business. Because the reality is that they can't be in a very good financial position operating on a 365-day 1 to 2 LTGP to CAC. And so there's a lot of financial pressure here. Generally, we're looking to work with businesses that are at a 2+ to where we can drive a lot of quick value, get this higher, and then really scale. So do you want to confuse this equation by kind of decaying your ad spend and allocating it down the line and making this formula confusing? Or do you just want to keep it simple and just calculate CAC like normal, don't delineate it out, calculate LTGP like normal, and then don't erode it or anything because of the further acquisition cost to reacquire those customers, and then just calculate it as it is? Because that's ultimately the purpose of this metric. The purpose of this metric is a financial index of the performance of acquisition. And yes, it's costing you maybe to get that second purchase at 180 days. And maybe it's costing you a little bit more on ads to get that third purchase at 240 days. But that will still all get encapsulated in CAC if you just calculate CAC like normal, and then you'll still end up at the same metric. And so to loop back after what's kind of derailed into a rant on this topic is that how does this affect the reliability of LTGP to CAC? It doesn't. It doesn't impact it at all. Because the purpose of calculating LTGP to CAC over really long time horizons is to assess the quality of the business and index the performance of the acquisition strategy. And on this type of time horizon, using CAC to LTGP, just including it all, the purpose is to just assess whether the business is acquiring profitably or not. And so it doesn't matter. And then if you're looking at LTGP to CAC on small time ranges, it really matters even less, because paid media spend probably isn't incremental on retargeting a 30 to 90 day post-purchase audience. Like, probably all of your lift there is going to come from email, SMS, direct communication channels, organic, etc. Now, what is the second approach? This is actually the more complex approach. So if you thought that was complex, this is where it gets a little bit more complex, which is we've still got the same two metrics that we're looking at. So we've got new customer profit contribution, and we have returning customer profit contribution. But rather than doing a basic ad spend reallocation, where we were just calculating this like normal, but then we were taking ad spend and actually just shifting it over into this, what we instead want to do is redefine the new customer definition within this particular reporting scheme. And so, and this is where this question really comes from, and the issue with calculating acquisition MER on an 8 to 9 figure brand is that the one reality of acquisition MER, if you are staying within one geo and not like moving global, is that if you take time and you take aMER, it will always degrade. And ultimately it should, no, it will never degrade to zero, because you continue to have new populations entering into the target market. So it will never technically go to zero, because you'll never saturate 100% of the market, because new people enter markets consistently, but it will decline. And the reason why it will decline is that you just get so much saturation that there's no net new customers. If you think about this, for example, on the instance of like Pepsi or Coca-Cola, like every single person watching this video has drank a Pepsi or a Coca-Cola. Like it's highly unlikely that anyone watching this has never had one of those two drinks. And so then you look at their acquisition MER on acquiring brand new customers, and you're like, this is a vanity metric. It doesn't really matter. What they should be focusing on is obviously acquiring like new generations as they're aging into the like soft drink market, for sure. But looking at this as like an index for paid media performance is kind of irrelevant. So what do you do here? Well, you look at MER, so you can just completely re-index towards MER. But for most businesses, they're in this like middle ground where they're not Pepsi and Coke. Then they can't just completely re-index to a marketing efficiency ratio and just assume that all their spend is just reacquiring existing customers. But then they also can't look at acquisition MER, because it's degraded to a level where it's kind of unproductive. And so there's this middle ground where it's like, how do you solve for this particular issue? And the way that you solve for it is complex and annoying, and it's not something that I love, but it's what you would technically have to do to fix this, is you start redefining new customers. And so you, for example, could say that your attrition period on an average existing customer is 400 days. And so anyone that has purchased greater than 400 days ago is now redefined from a returning customer into a new customer. And this is relatively easy to do. So you can do this in a custom software solution. You can do this in a Google Sheet as well. Like this takes no time at all. In fact, I've kind of already built this. So we can just redefine old existing customers into new customers. And then you just regenerate all the numbers. And so you are taking total ad spend. So this is just like normal. Nothing changes here. This is rev minus cost of delivery. You're not doing any fancy moving cost ad spend around. All you're doing is then redefining your new customer revenue into genuine new customers, plus anyone who hasn't purchased in 400 days. And then that's going to give you a read on aMER, which technically is an aMER because it's around this new definition. You're also going to get a CAC number. And so your cohort sizes are going to grow substantially because you're like reacquiring existing customers who have lapsed over time. But the question like you really need to ask yourself is, what makes more sense for you? Do you want to start redefining really old customers as new and then using aMER, CAC, and approach it that way? Or do you just want to simply shift ad spend around in the delineated profit contribution P&Ls and work at it that way? Like, it's two different approaches. I don't think either one is better than the other. If it was my business, I would run the left. I think the left is a little bit more intuitive and a little bit more accurate than the right. Because the right, you're inferring that your allocation of ad spend across these two P&Ls is an accurate representation of what the platforms are actually serving on, which just isn't correct. Like, the platforms will spend more accidentally on these audiences. It's also introducing a little bit of complexity into the actual decision-making process off the back of these numbers changing and how you actually want to like reallocate and reweight budgets and put next steps in place across the team. It does some weird things to accountability too. So if accountability is held on a retention team for RC, and then you're actually pushing spend over to RC and making contributions, that can be a little bit weird. So personally, I think the left-hand side is the better option. This just requires some custom modeling and some custom builds to be in place to be able to actually report in this way. But it's nothing too complex. Like, if you really want to do this, you can do it. And so I hope that provides some clarity into this approach where you're going to spend on existing customers. What does that do to aMER? What are your options? What does that do to LTGP to CAC ratios? And yeah, let's hope that wasn't too overkill.